Okay, so we're going to get into the last lecture session for today. After this session, I'm just going to have a little bit of a Q&A time. If we are going to read, you can do that. If you want to ask questions about the assignment, you can do that too. Just maybe before you go straight after Ross's lecture, I will just talk about assignment 2, which will be released soon. Just give you a little bit of the heads up on that. Okay? All right, Ross, I'm looking forward to this now.
Yeah, we've lost people.
They will come. Some of them.
They will come. Okay, so this lecture is on asset management strategy. The previous two I've delivered in previous years to the same class, 410s in these block weeks. So they were just getting updated and current information. This one is completely new. You are having the privilege of hearing it for the very first time that anybody's heard it. 10s, when we were talking about the today, you said, hey, it would be really good if we talked about asset management strategy and some of the very big picture things and how this all ties together. So that was, how you were dealing with your investment logic match. You're saying, what's the problem statement? That was my problem statement from 10, so that was a fairly loose problem statement. He does know that I work in this field a bit, so what I was able to do is pull some stuff together, and we started in a logical place and moved through. So what we're going to do is we're going to talk about the definition around organisational objectives and strategy out of the ISO and organisational plans and objectives. We're going to talk about how planning timeframes and cycles impact some of this stuff, both across New Zealand, but also some of the other country cycles as well. Then how that impacts us, how we manage it, and how we respond to it, and then some little international case studies that Tans gave me a little bit of a heads up as to where, what countries you as a group are from, so I sort of try to pick an example from each country, just for good interest. So what we're looking, this was the map that we saw right at the start of the day. We're up in this area here, the organisational plans and objectives that then flow down into strategic asset management and the asset policies. But this top area of the diagram for the ISO system. And again, this diagram, we're up in this asset outcomes, business outcomes area. Okay, asset policy, asset management strategy, objectives and plans. So we're right up in this top block. We're not down in resources or the enablers or even the service levels. We're sitting up at the outcomes and the business outcomes. This is straight out of the ISO. So ISO 55000, section 4.1, if you dig into the ISO. Now these ISOs, all the management ISOs, so 9000 and 14000, they're all the same sort of layout, so you find the same sorts of information in the same area. And it says, just I'll read it out there, the organisation shall determine external and internal issues that are relevant to its purpose and that affect its ability to achieve the intended outcomes of its asset management system, not IT, the total management system in ISO speak. Asset management objectives included in the strategic asset management plan shall be aligned to and consistent with the organisational objectives. So if we go back to this diagram, what we're saying is we set the organisational plans and objectives up here. The strategic asset management plan must be consistent with those objectives. What does happen over time, and that's what we're going to talk about a bit today, is that the organisation, its context, purpose and objectives can change over time. And that can be as a result of a change of government or a change of government direction or a societal change that we're no longer, what we're doing is no longer important, something else is important. So particularly for public assets, so we're talking in New Zealand big water systems, electricity, roads, bridges, all that sort of thing, the organisational objectives are set by legislation. sometimes multiple pieces of legislation. In terms of the water industry, the last time somebody counted, there were over 200 pieces of legislation that impact on water service levels. Because our politicians, these things build up over a long period of time, and try to address a specific issue over here, and there'll be some more legislation over there. Transportation is multiple tens of pieces, 10, 20 pieces of legislation that would impact. The key thing about legislation is that it can and will change over time. My theory is in New Zealand, if you put 120 people in Wellington and their job is to produce legislation, then they probably will. Because in our parliament, that's how progress is measured. Did we produce some legislation, and then the government departments and make sure that that happens. So we can expect legislation to be tinkered with all the time and change over time, because that's the job of members of parliament and governments to do. Interestingly, the big monopoly service providers, so that is transportation, electricity, water, wastewater systems, stormwater systems, in most parts of the world and coming in New Zealand, they have a quality and an economic regulation. Now, the really interesting thing about water service delivery, which we're having a massive debate about in our society, is up until very recently we had very loose quality regulation, and we had not really economic regulation. The economic regulation was undertaken by a democratic institution called the local authority. And that is changing. It was supposed to change under the previous iteration of the changes that have just recently been repealed, and it's certainly in the current proposed changes that we've got a big monopoly service provider, maybe goes out and builds a whole other water network or a whole other electricity network, and there should be quality and economic regulation. In Europe, in the UK, and the US, that is certainly the case, and in other parts of the world. So we've had a gap in our regulatory framework around three waters. For example, electricity for probably 30 years in New Zealand has had both quality in the Electricity Commission and Economic and Commerce Commission regulation. So we've had electricity regulated in a fairly standard international way, but we haven't had the waters. The other thing about these things is that there are specified payment cycles and documents in the legislation and regulation, and that's what my consulting practice basically is built on, is helping people meet specified regulated payment cycles and documents. We've got documents that you must produce every so often. You would think that most organisations would resource for that. I've been working for 25 years on the assumption that they can't resource all the time, which they don't, and that's good work for us. There's also public consultation requirements, because these are expensive big utilities, long-term funding requirements. Now, the other thing, and this is I think we're going to talk a little bit about today, is that there's what we call generational changes in direction. Okay, and the last big one was in the very late 1970s, early 1980s, so 40 years ago. Ronald Reagan in the US, Margaret Thatcher in the UK, and David Long and Roger Douglas in New Zealand, a little bit of a late follower. And so just a little bit of world history, way back in the 1930s we had a thing called the Great Depression, massive economic calamity. In New Zealand we had 30% of our workforce out of work, so massive unemployment. The US was much the same. It followed the big US stock market crash. It actually followed all the money that had been wasted in the fighting in World War I. So there was a knock-on from World War I reality, and it didn't help in its contribution to World War II. And at that time, in the mid-1930s, the Western democracies put in place a social democracy framework. So it's called the New Deal in America. It was President Roosevelt. It was in New Zealand. It was the New Zealand Labour Party. A gentleman called Michael Joseph Savage was the Prime Minister, and his parks named after him, and children were named after him. That was how much of a contribution he was seen to have made. And through the 1940s, after World War II, 50s, 60s, 70s, there was a basic this is how we do life in the rest of the democracies, okay? But in the 1970s, we had oil embargoes and oil shocks that were a big shock to the economies. And there was a big shift to this neoliberal economic thinking that happened. These were big proponents of it here. And we're about due for another change. So since that time, whilst we've had in New Zealand Labour national type, leading governments come and go, the underlying, this is how we do government and business in New Zealand, hasn't changed. What happens, and this is at a short-term level, the medium-term and the long-term level, is that you have these planning time frames and cycles. So in New Zealand, 3-year electoral cycle, our short-term planning cycle, funnily enough, is 3 years. USA it's 4 years, and their medium-term cycle, our medium cycle is about 10 years in New Zealand, US 10 to 12 years, UK have a 5-year electoral cycle, it goes out to 15. China, I've said they don't have an electoral cycle as such, but they have the National Party Congresses that happen every 5 years, where everybody gets together and sorts out what's going on. So China actually still has a 5 and a 15-year cycle. The long-term planning cycle for New Zealand is about 10 electoral cycles, about. So 30 years, US 40 years, UK 50. Interesting in countries that have been around for a very long time. So I think China works on 50 to 100-year cycles of big changes, possibly longer, because it's just such a long civilization. India, I think some of the really big cycles in India are quite longer than they are in the USA and New Zealand, for argument's sake. They're a lot younger countries. So that's why I said to China, 50 to 100 years plus. We're talking big societal changes and cycles that impact on how we do stuff. But keep in mind that about every 10 electoral cycles, you'll start seeing big changes in legislation and big changes in the way you're doing things. So the really interesting thing, if we go back to these leaders here, that was 40 odd years ago was the last really big change. And if you look at USA, UK, New Zealand, we're in about a 10 to 15 year phase at the moment where we can expect generational change in the way that we run our societies and also in the way we do our planning and stuff like that, and the way we organise ourselves as societies. We have seen it in New Zealand just recently where the previous Labour government was going, we're going in this direction, the new National League government comes up, we're getting rid of all that, we're going in this direction. So what we're actually looking at, and you can get worried about the day-to-day retail politics, but what we're looking at is we're in the middle of a generational change. And we actually don't have societal agreement about what the direction is. So we go this way, that way, this way, that way. And over the next period, it will settle down and we'll end up with a 30 or a 40 year where we're only making minor adjustments to the direction. Part of that, actually, interestingly, is going to be around the increasing digitalisation and use of machine learning AI in society will change the things we're doing. Yes.
That flip-flop, I have asked that question at the conference that you've been at, and the reason for that happening, apparently, is just the lack of investment. I reckon if you pump enough money into infrastructure, that flip-flop will not happen.
Potentially, I think that's only part of it. So we're going to look at that a little bit later in the lecture, sorry. So the other big changes that we can expect happening, we looked at them in the previous lecture, we're going to have some natural hazard resilience risk management that's going to change the way we do things and where we have towns and things like that. And our responses to climate change risk. And we talked about that in terms of population movement and things. Economies across the world, as a result of the climate change and decarbonisation things that we've signed up to, we're going to have a lot of electrification and decarbonisation. That changes some of the way we do things, particularly around our electricity grids. supply. We're going to see a lot more solar installations on private property at buildings. And we're starting to see that across the world, but we'll see that here as well. We're going to have this impact of doing things differently with AI. One of the things that happened after COVID is, for a period, the world's supply chains fell over. And this idea that I can pick up the phone, call a factory in China or Taiwan or Korea and say, 2 days later I want the part here at my factory wherever I am, didn't quite work. And so we're seeing quite major shifts in investment based on just, hey, we need stuff closer to supply chains aren't as robust as people thought they were. And some of that's getting wound up in nationalistic talk from various parts of the world, but fundamentally, COVID showed that there's a degree of vulnerability in supply chains, especially this just-in-time manufacturing of parts coming all over the world is winding back a bit, just because of supply chain insecurity, essentially. Another big change that's hitting us is this baby boom retirement and then the demographic change. Japan, China, South Korea, Italy, the sort of poster children, if you like, of ageing very quickly. And then we've also got international migration going on as well. So that is all coming into the mix of this a generational change in planning and policy. If I knew what the answer was, I would probably be on some kind of ministerial task force for sorting it out. So I don't know what the answer is, so I'm not on such a task force. But what I can say is that we can definitely observe that we're in this period of flux and change, and it will settle down over the next decade, and then there'll be a period of quite long, hey, we're doing it this way. So what does that impact on asset planning and infrastructure and things like that? First up, over the next 10 years, more advice and more work will be required to advising decision makers and people in governments around how we can adapt to the change. There is actually a lack of agreement over direction in New Zealand, and not enough funding, and we don't quite know where we're going, we haven't got enough money. It's not a good combination in terms of, as an infrastructure manager, how do you advise where to invest? How do you advise where the optimal investment is? And so now we come back to that ISO definition. The answer to that is you stay focused on the agreed organisational objectives and delivering those objectives until such time as they change. So often the change for organisations lags the society change a little bit, but sometimes it can happen quite quickly. And then expect more requirements in scenario development and options development and modelling. Just provide not a straight, provide an envelope of investment or an envelope of decision making as opposed to a single option. And then the other thing, particularly, you focus on must-do activities versus nice-to-do. I had personal experience with this because I started working in 1982, and we were doing stuff the way that had been going on in New Zealand. I know most of you going, hang on, I wasn't alive in 1982. I get that. My kids come in getting old, kids, you have kids around to do that sort of thing. I used to be running this gag that I was 30 something, and then my daughter turned 30 and it became quite an unsupportable gag. So anyway, the thing is, what happened, we were doing stuff in the 1970s way into the early 1980s, and in the mid 1980s we had this big shift in societal direction to the neoliberal, and there were whole lots of work that we were doing that they just said, no, we're not doing it anymore, and it just stopped. Are there gaps now as a result of that? Yes, but this is what happens when you get a big shift. Things that might have been really important 10 years ago, all of a sudden someone says, no, we're just not doing that. I'm expecting some of that coming up. Again, I don't know the exact detail of what that will be, But what you do in that situation is you work out what is the organisational objectives, and that would be set by legislation or practice or permits or whatever. And then one of the must-do activities within that. You also get really, really good at risk management. That's how you manage periods of very high change. Managing risk, discontinuity and change. So first up, get used to managing risk and uncertainty, because we're in for the next period of your careers, you're going to be in an environment where there's lots of uncertainty and lots of risk. And if you get good at that, you will be good at your career. If you don't get good at that, you'll get clobbered. Something will sneak up and you'll get caught on the wrong side of something. Understand the risks you're managing. So some of the biggest failures in engineering are around not understanding the risk or not anticipating the risk. That bridge that just found itself in Baltimore's harbour the other day, I'm not sure anybody thought that a container ship that size would hit the pier of a bridge when they designed the bridge. So that bridge is from the 1960s or 70s. Nobody even imagined that a boat that large, because they weren't that large back then, would lose power and hit the bridge. If a boat that size hit Auckland Harbour Bridge, it would be interesting to see whether the Auckland Harbour Bridge would still be standing at the end of it. And if you think about if you live on the North Shore, for argument's sake, and coming into town, that could be just a little bit problematic for the next 2, 3, 4, 5 years. You're either going to go around North Harbour, round up through Waitara. Could you imagine all of the motorway bridge traffic going that way? Or you're going to go down to Devonport and hop on the ferry, and both of those are fairly restricted corridors of route. So model your risk changes to increase your understanding. If you're interested in this, you are privileged to have as your lecturer and one of the best risk modelers in the world sitting in the room, Dr. Henry. And so don't be afraid to ask him questions. He knows more about this sort of stuff than most people have forgotten. So, but there's going to be more of that going forward. Be aware of the discontinuities that occur, and a couple of those. So 9/11 in the USA fundamentally changed the way that it was doing security. So it put about 20 government departments in one big beast called Homeland Security. If you go into the USA, the Transportation Safety Authority, the people that stamp your passport, are part of Homeland Security. As I said in the previous lecture, every single water and wastewater treatment plant had to do a security analysis, put gates up, have passes, all that sort of stuff. They did all that around all the major buildings and sites. It was about 10 years ago I went to New York, and they were still, but it's not now, it was there last year and it's changed, but back then, if you wanted to go and visit the World Trade Center Memorial, you either logged in the morning and put your passport details in so they could check whether you were a bad person or not, or you turned up and they took 2 hours to check you before you were even allowed to go onto the memorial. It's all open now, so they've got over that, but they had all that sort of security in place in the airports and the train stations and things like that. With COVID, we are in early days of changing the way we organise, manage, invest and prioritise. And with COVID, one of the big things has been the supply chain. And we're going to look at that a little bit more. The other thing is change is constant. And right now, I think the rate of change feels like it's speeding up. The reason I've put a picture of the Wright Flyer in, first controlled flight by man. If you're ever in Washington DC, the Smithsonian Aeronautical Museum actually has one of those in it, which is phenomenal. You're sitting there looking at this thing's huge wingspan. They didn't quite have the mass to go, how can we shorten the wingspan? So they made it, if you're going to die if you get it wrong, I guess you're over-engineered. But if you think about back then, when you went from sailing ships to steam, you went from people hand building weaving clothes to steam engines, you went from nobody flying to people flying, you went from horse and carts to automobiles, and then by electricity came in through that period. I think back in, say, from about 1850 or 60 through the early 1900s, there was, in terms of the quantum of the change, much more rapid than we've got now. But then we've got fairly rapid change going on now in the digitisation, AI. You think, oh, how do you keep up with it? Imagine if you were a cartwheel maker in the USA when Henry Ford started producing cars. You'd go, hang on, my entire business is going to be out of business in 5 years because nobody's going to be using horse and cart anymore. So the point I'm trying to make here is that change is happening all the time. It feels like it's fast at the moment, but in historical terms it's probably not quite as fast as it has been. But you need to learn to recognise change, manage it, manage the risks around change, particularly with big public assets. On the flip side, we can go back to the ancient Persians who had the royal road from, at about 5,000 or 6,000 BC. There were roads in China that are fundamentally pretty much the same as roads, maybe different surfacing, but no, we had a piece of land that people came up and down. The Persians had water supplies of about 2.5 and public wastewater systems of 2,500 years BC. So a lot of the big networks and things that we're doing are not new concepts. They've been around for 4,000 or 5,000 years. And they've changed. Some of the technology we're using has changed, but the basic idea hasn't. Roman aqueducts is another example. And so, whilst again it feels like everything's changing, we're using networks and ideas and processes that have been around human civilization for 3,000, 4,000, 5,000 years, which doesn't sound like a lot of change, does it? So, one of the things that's interesting in what we've got here in New Zealand, but also internationally, is when you have regulatory uncertainty, it stifles or halts long-term investment. Because how do I know what the right investment is and how do I know whether it's the optimal investment? And the more uncertainty, the higher the cost premium or the risk premium of that investment. And an example, poor old Argentina is an international example over the last 100 years, where they've had international investment and then they've gone, no, we'll have all of that. So they've said, we'll nationalise it. So if you're investing in Argentina and you think, oh, hang on a minute, they could nick it all, they could steal the investment, you want a fairly high premium for your investment to cover the risk of that happening. Now, that's a very extreme example. Zimbabwe was another example. So they had a whole of private farms, and they had so-called war veterans who were actually not old enough to have been alive when the war happened, and they nationalised all these farms, which are now no longer farmed, because who would invest in something, irrigation and other systems and tractors, and when it might be nationalised at a moment's notice. So Zimbabwe has gone from being a country that fed the entire sub-Saharan Africa with grain to now imports grain because it's no investment in its farming. And that's happened in the space of about 20 or 30 years. So the higher the uncertainty, I mean it's a useful theory in any investment, the higher the cost of the risk, financing, insurance, bill costs all impact. And it also can mean that you don't have the resources you need, because if you're holding up investment, and that's right now in New Zealand, when you go and say, no, I'm not doing that, I'm not doing that, I'm not doing that. There's excavators and crews, construction crews around Auckland saying they do nothing, because the funding's been stopped. Now, you don't sit around doing nothing for very long, because you're running money. So you demobilise or you go somewhere else where the money is being spent, and you don't train new people when everything's demobilised and things like that. So you run that risk as well. And service levels, when there's big change and big uncertainty can change, decline in the legal be provided. This long piece of text is from Warren Buffett. So Warren Buffett is third or fourth or fifth richest man in the world. He's made all his money in investing in the USA. He puts out an annual letter to shareholders in February. I own the tiniest fractional part of one of his shares, like $50 or $100 worth. So I am a shareholder, there's a disclosure. But given that one share in Berkshire Hathaway is sort of $1 million New Zealand dollars, I don't own one share, just to be clear about that. And Berkshire Hathaway has a couple of big network assets. Electricity is one he's referring to there. They have a big rail network as well in the USA. And here he's writing an apology to his shareholders about the fact that they haven't made any money, or very much money, on the electricity assets, and that they are at risk of losing a whole lot of money. And this is not a man who has made his money by being silly in his investing. And there's a couple of things in there. They are doing a massive upgrade, but BHU, which is Berkshire Hathaway Energy, 10 states and 30% of the land area of the USA is what they provide electricity to. That's a lot of electricity lines. What has happened is in Hawaii and California, particularly, they've had those big fires that have come off electricity lines sparking and things like that. And the states have changed the law that says the electricity company is liable for that. Liable for all the loss of land, all the loss of forestry, all the loss of housing, loss of life. And in America they sue each other to heck and on for that sort of stuff. And so what the companies are having to do, the electricity companies, is start provisioning for that risk, which is can be tens or hundreds of billions of US dollars. And so what he is saying here is that that's after 70 years of the rules being in one direction, the rules have now changed. And I haven't, if you're interested, you can go and find it and read the whole thing. But what he's saying is we're not going to invest anymore. This is a man that has hundreds and hundreds of billions of dollars available for investment, saying we can't handle the risk. And the states that are changing these laws did work out where they're going to get the money from to invest, because they're going to end up owning the assets. And so this is what happens when you can understand why those states might have wanted to change those rules. They don't want to pay all the liabilities. We'll make the electricity companies. The one in Hawaii, I think, is going bankrupt, and one of the California ones has already declared bankruptcy. But the investors in those utilities are going, well, that doesn't work for us. And so you get a withdrawal of investment. How do you make it up? Because electricity networks are expensive. Okay, so that's the risk of uncertainty in major planning and investment, and that's a worldwide problem, but we have the same thing here in a different way. So our job as infrastructure managers, how do we respond? Our job is to deliver organisational objectives. So that's your problem statement. First of all, work out what your organisational objectives are, and then how do you deliver them. They are subject to legislation, regulation, funding changes, especially publicly owned assets. The issue we have in New Zealand is that we've got probably a couple of $100 billion over the next 30 years, and we're still trying to work out how we want to fund that. And do you invite private investors in? Can we provide the certainty for private investors, or are we going to raise that money through taxes or loan money long-term on international bond markets? All those sorts of questions. Investment needs of society and requirements can change over time. Standards go up, or now we all like to have cell phones versus and high-speed internet versus copper wire and What has been really interesting to watch in Africa and India and places like that, China, has been they've jumped, they've gone straight to cell phones as opposed to putting in lots of copper wires. That whole phase of development has been skipped, apart from the major cities. So it's now fibre optic, high speed, and mobile. And you go, well, that's interesting, because we had this time before high-speed internet where we had copper wires and years of communications. At the end of the day, you need some societal agreement on the direction that society is going in and going to invest. And that can take time, sometimes multi-decades, sometimes less. And we're going to look at some examples around that very soon. We as infrastructure managers also need to provide advice on the risk, changes, uncertainties, challenges, investment drivers, benefit cost value. It's all part of the job. And to do that, you have to understand what's going on to some degree and provide advice to support informed decisions. This is what am I talking about with informed decisions? It's this here. So we're living in a world where we can collect more and more and more data faster and faster. So the cost of sensors is nearly zero. We have drones, we have all sorts of things collecting data. We have, LiDAR imaging, or if you're land related stuff. What you have to do is take all that data and turn it into information. And a lot of people in our profession seem to think that's where the job stops. Oh yeah, I've got information. But you actually have to take that information and turn it into informed decisions. So take information that you've gained from data and then go, hey, what does that mean for our decision making? What is very interesting about this is that you can get buried in the data, and a lot of our public organisations are starting, we'll cut back all the data analysts because what do they do? But we've got multiple increasing streams of data, so you just end up with these data lakes. And you've got to sort out what they mean, because not all data is good data, and what's the story that data is telling you. And then that becomes information, and then you check that against continuing data streams. That might be dashboarding or things like that, but you still make some decisions off that information. And don't lose sight of that part of it, because at the end of the day, that's what people are looking for from highly trained professionals. So, some examples from New Zealand. This is a map of New Zealand state highways that's done a bit like the London Tube map. Like a schematic. Very recently, so previous government in New Zealand, the Labour League government, had a GPS government policy statement that set out these are all of our objectives, and fundamentally they were multi-mode, walking and cycling, roads, trains, all that sort of stuff. New governments come in, they've actually got a new GPS that's out for consultation right now, and the other one with the Labour ones, they had Road to Zero, which was safety. Over here, the new one is roads and safety. And fast roads as well. We don't want to go slow, we want to go fast. Okay, and you go, that's a big change. Well, it actually isn't. My team have lined it up, almost line by line. There's a lot of stuff in the middle of it, which you really expect because they've been produced by the same government department. So a lot of technical middle of that GPS is still much the same. Might have a different label or a different name, but pretty much you're trying to achieve the same thing. No government in New Zealand is going to say, actually, we want to kill more people on the roads. It's just not a policy objective of the New Zealand government. But you call it different names in the House Shield program and all that, so we give a little bit of different emphasis. So when you see big changes and it feels like a big flip-flop, probably 80-85% is actually still the same. So you can do that sort of analysis quite quickly, and then you just have to go, what a GPS does is it's an investment priority statement. So it directs investment in certain areas. Some of the programs that we were running last year will be wound up and won't be funded again for a while. In New Zealand we've had the water service. So last year the Labour government passed some legislation, 3 pieces of legislation that said this is the way we're going to organise and deliver water services in New Zealand. The new government has repealed all those before they had the chance to be implemented and is bringing in its own variation of that. The Resource Management Act's a bit interesting. So it was originally in 1991. I can remember when it came in. I was working then. It was a big change from the previous act. It was a 30-year generational change. And now it's coming up to just over 30 years. It was changed again by the previous government in 2003, and that change has been repealed. So we're back to this one that's had lots of alterations, and we'll get a new one in the next 2 or 3 years. But it's again a societal change, 30-year change, and we're saying, how do we manage our resources and what's important to us and how are we going to do that in a way that's equitable and those sorts of things. It's a big discussion. We're also using what's called national policy statements to direct that sort of stuff, and they're up for some discussion at the moment as well. So we're currently in New Zealand, we're experiencing reasonably big swings and changes in government policy. That's what it feels like, but underneath it, some things are changing but not others, so just be aware of that. The last major reorganisation of local government was in 1989. With the exception of Auckland's had a big change since where they did the Auckland amalgamation. We're also having a very large debate in New Zealand around what is called subsidiarity, which is decentralised or delocalised. So subsidiarity as a principle is you in government you drive decision making down to the lowest practicable level because then you have lots of local involvement. And countries that have states, so we're a bit unusual in New Zealand that we, let's say India, we could take Australia, Germany, United States as examples. They are federal. They have states, they have a central government, a state government, and then a municipal level below that. So they have 3 levels of government. We don't. We only have effectively have 2. We have regional local government, but we have local government and central. And in terms of the OECD, we're one of the most centralised in terms of devolution of powers that there is. And we're not a big country, so maybe that's the right answer, but people outside of, Auckland doesn't take very well to Wellington saying this is how you should do stuff. Okay, well, who are you? The other end of the island. The South Island takes even less well to Wellington, saying this is what you should do. So you have this localism and parochialism. You see it best in the rugby in New Zealand. The grown men will try and women will try and kill each other on a weekly basis to prove that their province is best. But the idea is that sort of thing. So that's an ongoing debate. We sort of go one way and then the other in one way. The current government is probably more about localism, and the previous government was probably more about centralisation. So it's not a settled matter, and you'll see polls backwards and forwards for that. Electricity sector decarbonisation. So our electricity generation and our electricity lines and our feeds to private houses were all based on, you've got a hot water cylinder and an electric range and you've got the heating. And all of our major industries are running coal, gas, and our cars will run on petrol, diesel. And we're saying, we want to have all of our major industries on electricity, all of our cars on electricity, and we want to charge them all at home. So I want to be able to pull 21 or 7 kilowatts of power through my car all night to charge it up. And our electricity network and our electricity generation is not designed for that change. And so we've got major changes coming up there, which we're well behind it. If we want to decarbonise our economy. Down where we live, there's a really big dairy factory not far north of the town I live in, and it's currently running on coal for its heating and that, and energy. If it changed over to electricity, they'd have to pull in about 15 kilometres of 33 kV line from the major substation. which is expensive. They simply, the current lines are just nowhere near big enough for that sort of change. In New Zealand, in summary, and this is I do take photos for hobby, so this was one lovely summer evening at the Botanic Gardens in Timaru, the photo I took. That sort of sums it up, okay? We're in a period of generational policy change, and there will be big swings. We're quite a large land area with a small population. We looked at in that demand lecture. We have geographical, natural hazard, climate change risk challenges. Because we're a large land area that has these challenges, we never have enough money to do everything, but that's not unique to New Zealand. We have a growing shortage of skilled people working in infrastructure. Great to be you guys again, in terms of coming into careers and that. We don't have any societal agreement on the way forward. One of the reasons is because we're such a nice place and we have no threats and we have nothing to focus our minds on what we should actually be doing. So we tend to just, we'll do this. It's part of the New Zealand character because we don't actually have to worry too much about things. There are countries in the world where you don't have that luxury. You have to remain quite focused on that. I was talking to Dr. Henning at lunch. Finland is an example of such a country. It lives right next to Russia. Russia has invaded them multiple times in their history. They have no illusions what would happen if they don't do certain things well, because they will end up speaking Russian and being part of the Russian Empire. So, and they were at one stage. Russians turned up in the early 1800s and the sea was frozen over and the Russians had cannon with longer range and they set their cannon up outside the range of the Swedes who ran at the time, so how do you want to do this? Now we can bombard you, you can't bombard us. This time. They had a bet as to when the ice would melt, and the Russians won and got the whole of Finland as a result of that bet. There's some thoughts that some unchanged hands between various individuals, but it was never proven. And they surrendered a fortress the size of what Singapore was in World War II, a massive fortress got surrendered to the Russians and they took over Finland. But the Finns are very focused. They know who their next door neighbours are. It's never going to change. The Russians are always going to be the next door neighbours. And Russia has certain ways of acting that if you're a small country next door to it, you need to be aware of. We don't have that problem in New Zealand. We're a long, long way from anywhere. And maybe we get the old albatross that's flying out to sea that gets grumpy, but not a major threat really. So that's why we don't have that, because one reason we don't have that is we just don't have any threats that focus our minds on doing things. There are ongoing challenges that New Zealand has, like every country, but we still have much to offer in terms of opportunity. I mean, when we're doing lectures like this, you're talking about the issues and the challenges, but there is a whole good side, and that list I put up in the demand lecture as to why people still come here as part of that. So keep a balance when you think about these things. Don't look on the depressive, the dark side. There's lots and lots of good, but there's lots of challenges as well. So I've got some international examples now. USA, interstate highways, started in 1956, finished in 1992, so it took them 36 years to build out the interstate system. It was $610 billion in 2023 dollar terms, US. 78,000 kilometres of highways started by President Eisenhower because they were having a little problem down here in Cuba with the Russians, those Russians again. And most of the military was over here, and there was no way we were going to get them over there in time. So we need these roads strategically. And one of the things, if you ever follow or observe American politics, they always seem to be, having these huge fights about things, but they also have things that they lock in and fund over very long periods of time. And so this was one of them. They funded this for 36 years and built out effectively 80,000 kilometres of superhighways. And they're all coming out for replacement now, which is a whole other story. And each and every state has to fund their replacement within the state, which is causing issues. But what they had was they ended up with a very broad societal agreement that they needed a highway system like that, funded it, kicked on and built it over 36 years. Another one example in the USA is in 1974 they passed the Safe Drinking Water Act. It is still funded. The EPA administers it. So towns and cities and small towns can get money from the Safe Water Act to upgrade their treatment and stuff like that. Now they have a whole lot of conditions around that, as you'd expect from a federally funded program, but this is a program that's been running since the 1970s to upgrade water supplies. The Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, wonderful title that President Biden passed in 2021, $1.2 trillion of US investment in infrastructure and jobs. They passed a thing called the CHIPS Act in 2022 that again locked in all the money. And they have various federal and state initiatives. The big trends of discontinuity, so 9/11, they did the Homeland Security that we talked about. Post-COVID, they're doing supply chain consolidation. So they're bringing stuff back onto American soil. They're going to Mexico and Canada, which is the nearshoring, and then they're going so-called friendshoring as well. The Americans at the moment are also quite active in security and investment alliances post-COVID, and then you've got the impacts of massive data streams and AI analysis. So, CHIPS Act, this is from the Economist Intelligence Unit. These are the companies that have been, this is the subsidy they received, and this is the state that it's going into. And so the really interesting one is TSMC, which is a Taiwanese company, have received $6.8 billion US to build a plant in Arizona to make chips, make very high density silicon computers, supercomputers, military, etc., and consumer electronics. Intel have a really big plant in New Mexico. They've got $8.5 billion US subsidy. So that's not the money they're putting in as a company, that's just what the government's giving them. That sort of investment, so that's the whole thing is $2.8 billion US. These are just the first ones on it, but that's going to drive an awful lot of investment in the USA. This is the sort of thing that happens. So this is Lebanon, Indiana. Who's heard of Lebanon, Indiana? I haven't, by the way, until I saw this article. Professor Isley at Purdue sent it to me. So Lebanon, Indiana, which you shouldn't have heard of, was only 1,600 population. The reason they sent me the article is they're proposing to put a water pipeline right across the state of Indiana to make water from this river, which happens to be right next to Purdue University, to feed water into this massive industrial park. 2,800 hectare industrial park. 2.1 billion investors of Eli Lilly are a pharmaceutical company. Lots of jobs, and the reason it's in the papers is because there's all sorts of skullduggery going on about who knows about what and who's getting kickbacks from the investments and all that sort of thing. But they're bringing water in from all over the place. They've got massive investment going on in new infrastructure in quite small towns. They're building this stuff next to an interstate, so they've got really good access for port stuff coming in and out. And then that Indiana sits just below Chicago, which is one of the three largest cities in the US, so they'll use these states to take stuff up to Chicago now. So this is what this government investment is starting to kick off. Another example is Bryan County, Georgia. Again, who's heard of Bryan? Not me, guy. Have a look at that YouTube if you've been. It's like about an 8-minute YouTube showing you what's going on. There's just the pace of the construction and the development is just staggering. So that town has a population of 2,500. 1,200 hectare industrial park. This is Hyundai that's doing this. Is the lot Hyundai are planning to build, which is a 5.5 billion US investment in electric car and battery manufacturing in this wee tiny town. They've already started. Lots of construction jobs are near the interstate. They're near Savannah, Georgia, which is a very old city in the US. It used to be the capital of the Confederation during the Civil War at one stage. They have a really good port and airport. So Atlanta Airport's the biggest airport by movement of planes in the US, and it's quite close to the site. So the site has been picked for very good reasons. Savannah has quite a good port. Water and wastewater capacity are real issues, and it's in this little YouTube. You've got this sleepy little town where everybody loves living, everybody knows their neighbours, the house prices are what they are, and all of a sudden you've got a $5.5 billion investment in your little town of 2,500 people. Just the truck movements alone to build that plant. It's not sleeping, it's not living anymore. In the video, one of the guys says, oh look, I'm living Korean, and all the executives come to my sushi shop and I'm making huge amounts of money, it's fantastic. And some other people going, oh, house prices are going up and we're making money, and that's great. Other people going, actually, I quite like living in my sleepy little town. Where everybody knew each other. So you get quite massive change, but this is happening right across the Midwest of the US. This investment by the US government is now driving masses of private investment. China, National Trunk Highway System. They've built 85,000 kilometres in basically 15 years, so half the time it took the Americans to build the same amount. I've been on a few of those roads in China and through the tolls. It works pretty well, the roads are pretty good. They're all Western concrete, lots and lots of bridges. Adding, in the 2020s, they were adding 10,000 k's of this stuff a year. So it's a major construction program. We'd be lucky if we had a kilometre a year to our home. So here in New Zealand, we're not. So China is quite good at organising major infrastructure investment. They've used public-private partnerships, they've got a mix of toll and non-toll roads, all works pretty well. The issue they're going to have, having built out that level of roads in 10 years, or 15 years, at a time when they were doing extremely well economically, is in 50 or 60 years' time. Because guess what they're going to have then? Concrete roads, concrete bridges. They're going to have a massive amount of asset renewal all in a very short time frame. And whether China is doing well economically at that point is yet to be determined. So whilst that has been a phenomenal effort, very clear national direction about achieving it, certainly been part of the success story of the Chinese economy in terms of getting products and goods, factory goods out to the coast and shipping to the world. From an infrastructure management point of view, the rail is much the same. There's been a lot of rail built out in China as well. Fast forward 50 or 60 years, they're going to have some tremendous challenges around maintaining and renewing it. It's a lot easier to build new roads than maybe long than it is to replace roads when you've got a lot of traffic on and used to using it. This is a very cool example out of India. And Tens and I were doing a job for the government of Sierra Leone, and in the very fertile country, not so much the way roads, we went, okay, hey, hang on, where's some examples of some really good rural roading programs that have been going on? And we ran into this Prime Minister's Village Road scheme in India and had a look at it. So they use very standard designs. The idea is to provide all weather access to any village that's of 50 or 100 population or more, so people can get out to the market towns, get out for education, get out for medicine. And this has been going on for 24 years, so it's multiple prime ministers, and it's a national program, and this is from their dashboard, so I just screen put the dashboard from their website, which I've given you. Well worth having a look at, because it's an example of a really good program. That's 24 years is a decent amount of time that's been funded and is still ongoing, and lots of success that they're reporting. So again, with India, they decided they needed to do that. There's effectively been a national consensus to do it. They funded it and continue to fund it, and they're reporting on this performance and success. So that's fantastic. India is also building superhighways. They started the multi-state in about 2002, funded by the International Development Banks and the Indian government. Mid last year they've done 6,000 kilometres, they've got about another 8.5. This is just a photo or a schematic of this Delhi. It was the first 8-lane expressway in India. The thing that's different, I guess, from New Zealand is you wouldn't see that many motorbikes on the road in New Zealand, but we don't have that many 8-lane superhighways either. So, yeah, different uses for different countries, but India is kicking on with a very big road program to free the economy up, and this is between the big cities and the big construction centres and things like that. Final example is the Philippines, and this is often from Manage.com as an article we did. So Metro Manila. So here's an interesting thing about some of the world's biggest cities. You can type in how what's the population of Manila into Wikipedia and you get about 10 million. Because Manila City Council is about 10 million, but Manila Metro, which is the contiguous metro area, is about 23 million. It's the 5th largest city by population in the world. And it's the same with a lot of the big Asian cities. The council is only half of the population. So don't ever fall into that trap. Always get the metro, contiguous metro area, because that's the stuff that impacts on the major transport map. So they have a 6-year presidential cycle. Different presidents have different slogans, but all of them are basically building infrastructure. This is one that they're doing, which is a rail system spreading out from Manila, just so people can commute easier and they can move a bit stuff around. And there's a blog article on that. So basically, lots and lots of infrastructure, and particularly particularly in Asia, actually. I mean, Singapore's doing the same sort of stuff as well. You've got clear national objectives that people are after. And governments, it really doesn't matter whether the government changes one way or the other. The funding's there and the delivery of infrastructure carries on through. New Zealand is not in that place at the moment for the reasons that I discussed. You get a lot done when you've got a national agreement on something, like the Americans with their states. When you're in a situation where we can afford to do nothing and have a philosophical discussion for a decade that really would impact our economic efficiency as a country, but very little else could happen. Maybe a few people would move out of the country to Australia where they are building stuff up in Asia. We've had examples in New Zealand's past when we built out the big hydro systems and the Waikato and down in the Waitaki Valley, where we built dams and hydroelectricity for 20 years or 25 years in a row. That's what we're going to do. So some of it depends on your development phase as a country, but once you get a national consensus that you need to do something, and again, that example I really like is that one, because that one has survived multiple changes of political party. It gets funded and everybody says yes to doing that as a country, and it just goes on and gets done. And the thing I like about this one is they are reporting back on progress. Anybody can go, I could go and look and say, well, we've done 188,570 projects. Wow, that's quite a few projects. And like this. So that's part of your performance reporting. That's about what I can say on AIM strategy. We have consensus, you can do things, and other times you waste a lot of time and effort discussing things. Yes.
Great, thank you. Maybe just starting the questions are asked. This is at quite a high level. What would be your message to the asset managers? Like asset managers from councils.
Yeah.
What would be your message to them?
My message to them is understand your organisational objectives. which is a bit like that problem statement, and then deliver that to the best of your ability, or your organisation. You will find gaps, because no organisation is perfect. When the organisational objectives change, be that by legislation or other, then change with it. I think that is the key message there. As my dad, who's just turned 85 recently, was a public servant in New Zealand back in the days when we had a very strong public service ethos, and so I grew up in a household where you were there to serve the government of the day and you didn't have an opinion about whether the government was going one way or the other. And I think that is, for people in government departments or public authorities, public utilities, whatever, that is a really good idea to keep in your mind. You're there to deliver your organisation's objectives, not what you personally believe. If you don't like it, find another job, basically. And if you can do that, you'll end up with a high level of professionalism in your work. And if you'll be able to, it doesn't matter what the political winds are, you will always be able to deliver services to your community. I know people who get very caught up in the political winds, even here in New Zealand, and if it's one type of government they hate it, and if it's another type of government they're very happy, and they find themselves in different paths of their careers because everybody knows their position. There is a lot to be said for being quite neutral and just being able to help people with the skills that you have.
Good, thank you. Questions? Stunned. Long day. Long day. Okay. No, all good. Okay. Ross, thank you so much for coming to lecture to us. We appreciate it, and thank you also for your ongoing support of this course and also the infrastructure management program. So Ross has been somebody that I can rely on for always helping out. So thank you.